All right then. Well, welcome. I'm glad you could all make it this evening. I'm delighted to welcome Carole Newlands, who is a distinguished professor of classics at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's best known for her work on the poetry of Imperial Rome, with extensive publications, including a monograph on Ovid's Fasti, which I fondly remember reading hot off the press when I was a graduate student in the Bodleian, and two monographs on Statius, as well as one of the green and yellow commentaries for Cambridge University Press on Book 2 of Statius's Sylvae, as well as manifold articles on many Roman poets. But she started out in comp lit and has very wide-ranging literary interests. In fact, she's also published on Bede's Life of Cuthbert and Froswither's plays, a 10th century Saxon nun. I hope she won't mind my having dragged those up from quite a while ago.
It's my first article, first published article.
Well, very impressive. And her latest work, in fact, she specializes also in reception studies, I should mention. And her latest work in this area is a monograph, which is currently under review. So we can look out to see it relatively soon, I hope. It's titled The Voice of the North, Scotland and the Classics. And it's in relation to this topic that she'll be talking to us this evening, with a paper titled Tree Felling and Other Epic Topoi in Walter Scott's Waverley. So I'll invite everyone to make sure that they are on mute until Carole has ended her talk. And then we can unmute ourselves to ask questions. Thank you. Take it away, Carole.
Thanks very much for your introduction. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, this in a way is work in progress. So I'm really grateful to have an audience who can give me feedback. And also it's really quite out of my comfort zone. It's the first time I've talked publicly about Walter Scott. So anyway, but it's been very interesting to work on this talk. And so I'll just get started. Walter Scott has the distinction of being the only author to have a railway station named after him. Uh-oh. Yeah. And thousands of tourists climb Scott's monument every year. But I'm not sure they know exactly the importance of the person who's sitting sort of toga-clad, looking glum in a book, with a book under the arches there. He does have the nice distinction of having a plaque in Macker's Court in the Royal Mile, but you have to look down to actually see it and what it says. So how many people read Scott's novels today? Yet Waverley, his first novel, was a groundbreaking book. Its publication in 1814 established the phenomenon of the international bestseller, as you can see from this French copy. With this novel, Scott made a significant transition from being a successful poet of sort of romantic epic poems to being a wildly successful novelist. It was it was a radical change in his career, and perhaps one reason why he published Waverley anonymously and didn't divulge his authorship till 20 years after its almost over about 15 years after its publication. Moreover, as Georg Lucas has argued, Scott was innovative in making historical prose fiction a major subgenre of the novel, and thus bringing it to a new level of seriousness. In Waverley, Scott inserted the fictional story of the coming of age of a young man, a Bildungsroman plot that we see already in classics with Apuleius, into the historical events of 1745 to 46, the civil war occasioned by the Jacobite uprising in Scotland that sought to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. What I will argue today is that the ancient past, in particular the Troy story, also profoundly shapes the narrative of Waverley and its interpretive possibilities. Tropes and citations from classical epic, the Aeneid in particular, are crucial features of Waverley that connect the personal journey of the young hero Waverley to the larger narrative of the historic struggle over a unified Britain. The language of epic poetry offered Scott a powerful means of illuminating a period of turbulent change in Scotland. As Ian Duncan argues in his introduction to the Garside edition of Waverley, the edition I'm using here, Waverley offers the reader a representation of national life. But is this national life Scottish or is it British? That's one of the questions at the heart of a novel that concerns itself with national identity and with cultural loss. Roman epic poetry has historically played a crucial role in the formation of social values and national identities. In the early 19th, large reading public would still have been familiar with the Aeneid, whether in Latin as a school text, in Dryden's famous translation of 1697, or in Gavin Douglas's 16th century translation that was edited in a deluxe edition in 1710. Moreover, as Colin Kidd and others have shown, the Aeneid was a key text for the Jacobites, understood as an epic of political exile and refoundation that offered a powerful paradigm of rightful restoration of the Stuarts. Classical tropes and classical citations provide a provocative and ultimately tragic counter-narrative to the novel's plot of the quasi-successful Union of Britain. How should the past be remembered? And who owns the past? Are pressing questions of this novel that I will explore through discussing some of these significant citations and tropes. But first, in Waverley, as Scott engages with a long-standing, significant strand of Virgilian reception, that of the Aeneid as tragedy. The unfolding of the Jacobite uprising is represented through a framework of vivid but flawed heroes and great events. The narrative is accompanied by a persistent dialogue with the Troy story, as told by antiquity's most authoritative text on Troy's collapse, Virgil's Aeneid, and mediated here also by John Dryden's translation. For Scott was also a skillful editor who annotated John Dryden's works in 18 volumes, culminating with Dryden's much admired translation of Virgil's Aeneid. This Dryden's edition, edited by Scott, was published in 1808, just as Scott was embarking for the first time on his own work of prose fiction. Thus, Scott, a scrupulous, meticulous editor with a vivid historical imagination, was immersed in Virgil's epic poetry while he was writing Waverley. And as I mentioned, the Aeneid was, as Vicky Coleman puts it, the preferred textbook of Jacobitism. Scott thus edited a translation of the Aeneid that was shaped by Dryden's Jacobite convictions. Like Virgil's Aeneid, Dryden's translation was written at a time of political change and uncertainty, with a new political order in place under a new monarch, William of Orange, and the Stuart dynasty in exile. Dryden cloaks his politics in translation. As James Wynne and Steve Zwicker have shown in their work on Dryden, the English poet makes Virgil's language politically contemporary, often by choice of words and expansion of Virgil's Latin verse. Philip Hardy comments that Dryden thus follows Virgil in working into his translation the history of his own transitional, turbulent times. For example, In the opening lines of the Aeneid, Dryden's support of the exiled Stuart court is insinuated through pointed additions to Virgil's verses. So let's look at this slide. And if you notice, Dryden's translation slightly alters Virgil's fato profugus, okay, fugitive by fate. For Dryden, it becomes expelled and exiled. So he emphasizes the exile and the divine hatred behind it too. We just have the cruel Juno, but it's unrelenting hate in Dryden. Exiled and expelled and exiled, I think, is a politically pointed hint at the plight of the Stuart king, forcibly exiled at this time with his court in France. But perhaps the alterations are more obvious if we turn to the following slide. And my PowerPoint seems to have stuck a little bit. There, okay? I hope everyone sees that, okay? So this is the next few lines of Virgil, and here Dryden introduces new words, restored and sure succession for Virgil's genus undi Latinum Albanique patris at qual taimonia Romae. There's nothing about sure succession or restored. Restored and succession were key political terms at the time that demonstrate Dryden's adherence to the Jacobite principle of hereditary rather than elective monarchy. Trojan myth is thus altered in Dryden's translation of Virgil's opening lines to fit the political crisis in British monarchy. Translation for Dryden was a means not only of demonstrating his genius as an English poet, but also of adapting Virgil's text to his contemporary concerns and beliefs. So let's turn to Waverley and first to its plot and main characters before I discuss how consistently epic allusion deepens and complicates the novel's historical narrative. So the plot is fairly straightforward. It's a building romance plot inserted into recent historical events. Okay, young Waverley, raised in England by an uncle with Jacobite sympathies, goes up to Scotland as a recruit in the Hanoverian army. His father, however, is in the Hanoverian government, a firm Whig. This will help Waverley eventually when he gets involved in the Jacobite rebellion and needs to save his skin. Okay. He takes leave from the army and visits his uncle's old friend, Baron Bradwardine, who's a Jacobite, unable to hold arms or any kind of office because he fought in the 1715 rebellion. And then he goes from there to the Highlands to Fergus MacIver, chief, and it happens to be oh, okay. Somebody enlarged that. Did you do that? Because that was helpful, actually, to see it bigger. Okay.
Carole,
Can
sorry.
everyone read it?
Well, I can read it, but everyone has the ability on their own screen to make whatever you're showing look larger for themselves. And
Oh, I see.
you should have that too. If you kind of hover your mouse down over, usually it works when it's Yes,
Well,
so can you see a dot, dot, dot at the bottom of your
yes.
screen against the black? So
Mhm.
if you hover your mouse over that, you'll see a little menu that says magnify slide only for me. Um, and you'll be able to click on the plus to make it bigger for yourself if that helps you to read it.
Trying to magnify slide for all if that's helpful.
Ah, well, I think because we can each of us do that,
Okay.
um, if we need to, then that should be fine. If you do it for yourself, if you need to, and then everyone else can do the
I was
same.
just trying to summarize what's on this slide, actually.
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna back out again now.
Okay, well, typically it's not working for me, but okay. Let me go back one. Okay, sorry. Okay, well, I can't. So, okay, now I need to really go back. Um, just in brief, Waverley gets swept up with the romance of the Jacobite rebellion. He fights. He goes south to Derby. Everything falls apart. He escapes. And thanks to his English connections, he's saved. But Fergus McIver, the chief who took him under his wing, is hung, drawn, and quartered for treason. The Baron, his uncle's old friend, goes into hiding, and thanks to Waverley's English connections, including someone called Colonel Talbot, an Englishman who Waverley saves from execution on the first battlefield, helps save the Baron and Waverley. So in the end, as happens with these buildings remand plots, Waverley marries the Baron's daughter Rose, and perhaps there's a happy ending. That's the question. Okay, so maybe it'll be clearer if I go over the characters. And sorry for messing around with that PowerPoint. Um, Waverley. So he's really the typically Scot vapid young male hero, aptly called Waverley because he is a waverer. Takes him a long time to decide whose side he's on. Okay, Baron Bradwarden, first host of Waverley, Jacobite friend of Waverley's uncle. Okay, emerges, I would argue, and so does Ian Duncan, the editor of my edition, as the real hero of the novel. He's the father of Rose Bradwarden, who will in the end marry Waverley, creating a sort of union between England and Scotland. Fergus McIver, second host of Waverley in Scotland in the Highlands, romantic, volatile hero who sweeps Waverley into the rebellion. And he's executed. And he is the brother of Flora McIver. She's a Gaelic scholar and talented musician, harpist, tradition bearer of Gaelic culture. And she's the main love interest of Waverley, but she'll have nothing to do with him. And Colonel Talbot, the Englishman who's rescued by Waverley on the battlefield, and he comes to Waverley's rescue after the Jacobite defeat. So hopefully that helps, then gives context to what I'm talking about next. And I think that Flora McIver, that name was chosen Flora probably because she's modeled in some way after Flora MacDonald, who was famous for disguising Prince Charles Edward Stuart as her handmaiden to help him escape to France. This is a nice portrait by Alan Ramsay. Okay, so let's begin with the Baron because he's the de facto hero of the novel. It's his property that will be the focus of the tree felling scene that I'll get to soon. He emerges in the novel also as the expression of a distinctive Scottish humanist tradition, which are the cultural roots of the Jacobite movement. This broad humanism is seen in the account of the Baron's reading list that has shaped his character and reinforced his political values. And so let me read this. This is the Baron's patriotic reading list. As for literature, he read the classic poets, to be sure, and the epithalamium of Georgius Buchanan and Arthur Johnson's Psalms of a Sunday, and the Delicia Poetarum and Sir David Lindsay's works, and Barbara's Bruce, and Blind Harry's Wallace, and The Gentle Shepherd, and The Cherry and the Sleigh. In addition to the classics, the Baron's reading list celebrates Scottish poetry, first the Neo-Latinists, and then the vernacular poets. So he celebrates a distinctive phenomenon of Scottish literature as constituted by vibrant parallel traditions of vernacular Scottish and Latin poetry. The politics of the Baron's reading uphold a broad vision of earlier Scottish literature as a distinguished part of Scotland's rich European inheritance that he has taken upon himself to preserve. Just notice there are no English works on his reading list. Peter Garside sees the Baron as a bibliomaniac, a bit like Scott, as you see his library here. But the list here is carefully chosen, for it demonstrates the Baron's patriotic reading, his patriotic Latinity. As for prose writers, he is an avid reader of the historian Livy, who offers him important models of the ideal Roman soldier farmer with the virtues of endurance and loyalty, a type that was vanishing in Livy's day. The Baron, however, demonstrates these republican Roman virtues when put to the test. The name of the Baron's house is Tully Veolan. So that name perhaps also associates him with another eminent Roman Republican author writing at the end of the Republic, Cicero, a political outcast like the Baron in the last years of his life, who persisted in resisting tyranny. Tully was a common name for Cicero in the 18th century. Among the significant roles that the Baron plays in the novel is to chart the course of the Jacobite uprising through citation of Virgil. He turns to the Aeneid at moments of special importance in his life. The arrival of Waverley to his house, his own participation in the Jacobite uprising, and his return home after the Jacobite defeat. He interprets these events through a Virginian lens that is also, of course, partisan, imposing upon them the Jacobite interpretation of the Troy story and complicating the political texture of Scott's novel. He cites in particular, though, from the most tragic book of the Aeneid, the cataclysmic fall of Troy in Book 2. I think as we read Waverley, we should pay attention to the context of these Virgilian citations, whose latent ironies can provide a fuller understanding of the political implications of the Baron's speech. So, to start just briefly with citations, when the Baron welcomes to his house Waverley, a young recruit in the Hanoverian army, he is tearful and almost overcome at meeting his old friend's nephew. The Baron's first words show his cosmopolitanism, for he greets Waverley in French, English, and Latin. Hope you can see this here. Okay. A worthy scion of the old stock of Waverley honour, spes altera as Marrow hath it. And you have the look of the old line, Captain Waverley, not so portly yet as my old friend Sir Everett, mais cela viendra avec le temps. The
Carole,
reference to, yes.
I'm awfully sorry to interrupt, but we're actually looking at the Baron's favourite history, Livy's of Rome slide.
Oh, and I have, oh, how did that happen? I'm sorry.
Is it perhaps that you're looking at the part of your screen that shows you what? Oh, now it's Waverley as Aeneas's son Ascanius.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, that's it. That's the one. Yeah.
Should I
Sorry.
read it again?
I think it's probably fine since we can see it on the screen.
Okay. So, the reference to Marrow just flags, right, the Baron's Latin phrase as a direct allusion to Virgil's epic, in this case to Ascanius, Aeneas' son, described as the second hope of great Rome in the Aeneid, in Aeneid 12, Magnae spes altera Romae. Ascanius, not Aeneas, will found the line of Alban kings that will lead to the foundation of Rome. So the Baron's reaction to meeting Waverley is thus political as well as emotional. He needs new blood to revitalize his ancestral line, and he has a marriageable daughter, Rose. The phrase spes altera hints at the Baron's hopes for generational continuity and renewal. The phrase also has a broader political resonance in terms of Scottish politics. As Ian Calvert points out, the phrase spes altera was well established in royal panegyric for hailing the heir apparent to the crown. It was particularly associated with the Stuarts. At Charles II's coronation, for instance, the triumphal arch praised his heir, James Stuart, as spes altera. Now, the antiquity of the Baron's family is demonstrated at the banquet with which the Baron hosts Waverley to the best of his means. And here we come to our first epic trope, ekphrases, or descriptions of a precious work of art. Okay. In a solemn ceremony, which I'll paraphrase here, the Baron produces from a special casket a golden goblet in the form of a rampant bear, which represents the heraldic crest or icon of the Bradwarden family. We're told that the crest was awarded during the Crusades to the Baron's ancestor, Godwin Bradwarden, for his heroic slaying of a formidable Danish warrior. The goblet is not only ancient, it has a mystique about it, at least for the Baron. Now, the ekphrases of a goblet, of course, has a long epic ancestry, going back to the ekphrases of Nestor's cup in the Iliad. Sorry, here we go. It is in the Iliad, Nestor's cup is not only a marvel, beautifully crafted, unique, but proves Nestor's manhood. He's able to lift it, though he's, 200 years old. Likewise, the Baron's cup is uniquely crafted, and I didn't put this in the slide, but he proves his manhood as he drains the cup of a whole pint, English pint, of claret in one gulp. Because the authority of the cup is lodged in past actions and in sacred domains, it's a powerful legitimating force of the commanding identity of those who draw on it. Now, originally in the past, this came from Denmark. So the Baron's cup validates the symbolic transfer of power from Denmark to Scotland. And the Baron validates that power by citing Virgil. And as it's a festive occasion, he does so with an atrocious pun. I think I have to go back. Yes, so here, okay. He says, and thus as Virgil hath it, mutemus clipios danaeum quinsignia nobis aptemus. Obviously, the Baron refers here to the transfer of power from the Danes, from Denmark to Scotland. His playful delight in classical learning is on display in the excruciating pun on Danes and Danaeum. Horrible. Yet the line, let us exchange our shields and fit ourselves with the insignia of the Greeks, alludes also to a troubling incident in Book 2 of the Aeneid, when Aeneas and his few surviving Trojan companions decide to disguise themselves in the armour of those Greeks whom they have already slain. There is thus further significance in this quotation. The Baron has learned under the Hanoverian peace to use classical literature as coded speech. Political cunning underlines the bonhomie. He has not given up his Jacobite loyalties, but he has learned to play a double game living in Scotland after the disaster of the 1715 uprising. He can act as a Greek while remaining a Trojan at heart. However, such dissembling also has ominous overtones. Sergio Casale, for instance, finds a disturbing pattern in the Aeneid, whereby the act of putting on an enemy's armour leads inevitably to ruin. Now, Scott was born in 1771, so he knew of the Jacobite uprising of 1745 to 46, not firsthand, but from documents and still living witnesses, including family members. The novel has an alternative title, not just Waverley, but or 'tis 60 years since, which suggests an explicit concern as much with the aftermath of the uprising as with the war itself. So let's turn now to the immediate fallout from the Jacobite defeat at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, which is made vivid through the violent destruction of the Baron's house and grounds by Hanoverian soldiers. The Baron himself, a fugitive, is hiding in a nearby cave, loyally protected by friends and servants. His ancestral paintings have been thrown out or used for target practice by the soldiers. Treasures are looted, among them the sacred cup, the Bear of Bradwarden, which is pawned down south. Although the cup is eventually returned to the Baron thanks to Colonel Talbot, the Englishman and friend of Waverley, it has lost its special casket and its mystique, for it has been pawed over by hands ignorant of its noble history and cultural value. The cup was a symbol of the continuity and strength of the Bradwarden line. Trees, too, suggest antiquity and the strength of family lineage. The Jacobite defeat is significantly marked by the felling of 2 huge trees by Hanoverian soldiers on the Baron's property, a symbolic destruction of the nobility and antiquity of the Bradwarden Jacobite line and of the greater cause to which his family over the centuries had sworn allegiance. So from the time of Homer and Achilles' violent fight with the river Scamander, the impact of war has been dramatized through the relationship between the natural world and military action. The felling of trees by soldiers within a wild forest to make a funeral pyre for the dead hero Patroclus first appears in Roman and Greek literature in the Iliad. It becomes a deeply rooted rhetorical trope in Roman epic and is always associated with death. Moreover, in Roman epic poetry, we find a growing sense of violation of nature that is both religious and environmental. As Richard Thomas has argued, tree cutting is represented in Roman epic poetry as a morally dubious act involving the disturbance of an ancient order in nature. It suggests, too, the destabilization of the social order. There's a hint of this in Virgil's tree cutting scene that becomes more prominent in later epic poets of it, Lucan, Statius. The penetration of an ancient wood, up till now untouched by humans, itur in antiquam silvam stabila alta ferrarum, conveys a sense of violation. The number of trees that are cut down, more than in Homer, also suggests a notion of excess. While the S sounds in the passage, particularly at the end, faxiniaqui trabis cunii set fistili robur scinditur, suggests violent action. The Baron was a keen arborist, we're told, but his fruit trees were also destroyed by the Hanoverian soldiers. In particular, his pride and joy, the 2 great chestnut trees, were felled in an unnecessarily brutal manner, not by axes, but by gunpowder. I'll quote, "One had been shivered to pieces by the explosion, and the wreck lay scattered around, encumbering the ground it had so long shadowed. The other mine had been more partial in its effect. About 1/4 of the trunk of the tree was torn from the mass, which, mutilated and defaced on one side, still spread on the other its ample and undiminished boughs." Susan Oliver's recent monograph, Walter Scott and the Greening of Scotland, is excellent in explaining the damage done to the very soil by the violent destruction of the trees through gunpowder. Their catastrophic destruction not only constitutes an allegory of the consequences of defeat for those loyal to the Stuart cause, but also draws attention to the rapid change in land use in Scotland that was destroying an ancient social and cultural order by driving people off the land. Trees are powerful symbols of longevity and fertility, of family and tradition, and of the state itself, whether imagined or actual. The Baron's horse chestnut trees symbolize all these things, and more aesthetic and more. Aesthetically, they are among the most beautiful of shade trees. As Fiona Stafford comments, they're not useful for timber or for nutrition, but they are visually spectacular, extravagantly arrayed in every season. It's not really very good pictures, but gives you some sense. The tree's mutilated forms visually express the deformation of Jacobite tradition as it had been cultivated on the Baron's estate. And they demonstrate the Philistine contempt of the victors for the history, the culture, and the care for the land that Tullyvelan represented. For not only is the land rendered toxic for new plantings, but the trees are destroyed in such a way that they will never grow again. The place where the chestnut trees once stood, an old-fashioned garden, has been levelled by the victors and made into a lawn, all traces of the trees removed. I quote, "In truth, not only had the felled trees been removed, but their stumps been grubbed up, and the lawn with grass. It was evident that the marks of devastation, unless to an eye intimately acquainted with the spot, were already totally obliterated. The grubbing out of roots," Oliver explains, "represent a strategy to ensure that nothing unwanted emerges from the dirt and soil. The monumental trees have been replaced by a grassy landscape of absence and loss, deprived not only of its ancient trees, but also of contour or variation. For Oliver, the restoration of the land, literally and metaphorically, signifies the obliteration of the past. The lawn represents a safe but bland present and future of metropolitan conformity, in which not only the Hanoverian violence, but also the richness of Scottish and Gallic traditions have been erased for the sterile prettiness of a capability brown-style garden." As Diana Spencer has commented, scenes of ruin in a Civil War landscape open up an urgent dialogue about national identity in the present. In Waverley, I suggest, the razing of the trees and the destruction of the exuberant, playful aesthetic of the Baron's estate can be associated to with the eclipse of a rich tradition of Scottish Latinity, both Neo-Latin and vernacular, secular and religious, that engaged with classical texts in imaginative, innovative ways. The Baron's house was not in the modern neoclassical style of the day, but was an eccentric mix of styles, Scottish and continental, and was decorated all over with sculpted bears, which of course were smashed by the soldiers. After Culloden, claims to the rightful definition of classicism are fought out first on the Baron's estate in this novel, where the neoclassical vanquishes the variegated, idiosyncratic, and patriotic aesthetics of the Baron. Although the 60-year rupture also consigns the Jacobites and the epic heroism they performed to the past, it's not Waverley, the man of the future, who occupies the last part of the novel, but the Baron himself. Waverley is married with dispatch and plays little role in the novel's ending. It's the Baron who acknowledges and laments the definitive end of a long history in Scotland and its rich patriotic identity. Characteristically, he does so through a final citation of the Aeneid, uttered while he is hiding in a cave from the soldiers. Fuimus Troyes, from Aeneid 2. We have been Trojans, a phrase whose preterite tense implies that the Jacobites no longer are Trojans. It's appropriate that the words come from Book 2 of the Aeneid, which narrates the fall of Troy as witnessed by the shocked, desperate, and grief-stricken Trojans themselves, in particular Aeneas. The words in question are spoken to Aeneas by Panthus, priest of Apollo, in despairing recognition that all is lost. Venit summa dies et ineluctabile tempus Dardaniae, fuimus Troies, fuit Ilium et ingens gloria Teocrorum. Panthus' speech marks a turning point in Book 2, as a mighty civilization crashes into ruins, taking with it children, parents, and Aeneas' wife, as well as most of the Trojan warriors. Panthus tells Aeneas that the cause is lost, that Troy is no more, and even that the Trojans no longer exist. At the same time, however, he hands over the sacred gods of Troy to Aeneas to take with him on his flight. Thus, some significant part of Trojan civilization, by contrast, will live on when Aeneas makes him the ritual center of his refoundation of Troy in Italy. The Baron, by contrast, is the empty-handed priest whose surrogate son, or second hope, has turned away from the Jacobite cause, desiring no more war, no more suffering, but a quiet domestic life in a nice neoclassical estate. When Waverley confesses to Colonel Talbot that the plumed troops in the big war used to enchant me in poetry, but the night marches, vigils couched under the winter sky, and such accompaniments of the glorious trade are not at all to my taste in practice. His disillusionment with the enchantments of poetry in the face of the realities of war is tantamount to a renunciation of heroic epic. He is, after all, no Aeneas or Ascanius. The Baron's two words, fuimus Troies, thus convey a blunt finality that is impossible really to render in translation. For the Baron, there will be no translocation of sacred rites and Trojan gods. No young hero now willing to suffer in the hope of a glorious renewal. So I just want to pass over a few slides and just go to my last slide and return to one last mention of the Baron. And it's a passage that particularly intrigues me, so I didn't want to miss it out from this talk, but I also don't want to try your patience anymore. So let me just see if I can get to almost my last slide. Okay, so to sum up, I'll say that I find Scott's broadly sympathetic novel and its dynamic use of classical epic extraordinary. In Waverley, Scott confronts Civil War polarity in 18th century Britain by challenging such binary thinking. Waverley suggests that the Civil War of 1745 to 46 should be understood not as it was represented in contemporary propaganda, as a struggle between the savage and the civilized, but rather as a conflict between two peoples living on the same island with regional differences that deserved mutual respect. Through the Baron in particular and his fluctuating fortunes, Waverley puts the arts, particularly Scottish poetry and patriotic Latinity, at the novel's emotional core. The more conventional Englishman Colonel Talbot cites only well-known snippets from Shakespeare, but rarely at that. So, very briefly, one final epic trope occupies the final chapter, an ekphrasis of a work of art, and this has been much discussed. In this case, the ekphrasis is not of an ancient sculpture or goblet, but a modern painting of Fergus and Waverley. The ancestral portraits that used to adorn the dining hall, if you recall, were thrown out or used as target practice. So this is a new painting in the refurbished dining room at Tullyvalen, which has been bought by the Talbots and gifted to Waverley and his family, which includes Rose, to whom he's now married, and the Baron. In the painting, both Fergus and Waverley are together, wearing tartan dress. So I'll quote the passage as my final example. It was a large and animated painting representing Fergus MacIver and Waverley together in their Highland dress. The scene a wild, rocky and mountainous pass, down which the clan was descending in the background. It was taken from a spirited sketch drawn while they were in Edinburgh by a young man of high genius and had been painted on a full-length scale by an eminent London artist. Raeburn himself, whose Highland chiefs do all but walk out of the canvas, could not have done more justice to the subject. And the ardent, fiery and impetuous character of the unfortunate chief of Glen Achwaich was finely contrasted with the contemplative, fanciful and enthusiastic expression of his happier friend. Beside this painting were hung the arms which Waverley had borne in the unfortunate Civil War. The whole piece was generally admired. This ekphrasis has been criticised as promoting an imperialist historiography through its false representation of Highland culture and the invention of tradition, and I think an expression coined by Trevor Roper. But I think the invention of tradition is Scott's point, and at least for some readers, you might be appalled by it. The two men, standing side by side, offer a fictitious view of national unity in a country still geographically and culturally divided. The reference to Raeburn's Highland chiefs reinforced that sense of falsehood. And by the way, Raeburn never did two chiefs together. So there's even more fiction in having Waverley dressed up as a chief. And this guy, we know Glengarry went to Oxford, so hardly the same character as Fergus. The viewers, including Waverley, politely admire the painting. Note that it's only the Baron who has an emotional response, who has tears in his eyes. Waverley's lack of emotional response to the painting of his friend is a final moment in the novel, in its last chapter, that represents, I think, the attempt in Scott's modern era for the erosion of memory and of the rich Scottish culture that the Baron represented. Thanks for your patience.
No patience needed, Carole. That was riveting. Can I invite everyone to unmute themselves so that we can give a real round of applause rather than using the little yellow hands that fade all too soon? Thank you so much. That really was a fascinating talk. I'm full of questions, but I'm going to be a good host and instead ask whether anyone else would like to go first. You can just raise your hand using the little raise hand icon at the top because I can't see everyone at once, I'm afraid. Luke. Oh, and I've just noticed I need to stop recording for this bit, don't I? So I'll stop.